Hello, in this video, I'd like to go through some of the common techniques for creative ideation. That is the best ways that you can come up with the best ideas for solving your design problem. There are a number of techniques I'm going to go through. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind. I will try not to take too much of your time here. I'm going to start with the first category of getting yourself ready to be as creative as possible, and then moving into creating solutions, some standard techniques for that to do your initial ideation. And then, because every ideation session typically runs into some challenges, you run into periods of time that you're not generating ideas, we call that getting stuck. So then I'm going to go through 4 additional techniques that can help you break out of that being stuck in your ideation. Okay, so starting out, problem definition is an absolutely essential thing before you get into ideation. You've got to know the problem that you're solving. I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but I just want to remind you that that's critical. Once you've got a good problem defined, then a good thing to do is to think about analogies. Analogies are a way of relating the problem that you're trying to solve with another problem that perhaps has solutions already, or perhaps you know more about. So some quick examples of some well-known cases where analogies help to solve problems. I love the one of Velcro. You're probably familiar with this. Burdock root seeds have the basic shape similar to Velcro, where it grabs onto things like fabric. These are the things you get stuck on your socks. Bohr's atom model was an analogy. Let's see, as you can see, their Staples stores were created using supermarkets. So this is used in business, it's used in product development, it's used in science, fuel cell plates like the leaves on a plant. It is a great approach to try to get a different perspective on your problem. So it's a nice thing to think about before you actually get into coming up with new solutions. Make sure you've looked at other solutions in totally different applications. So real quick, I'm going to use this idea of a robotic basketball player throughout this video. And some quick examples there. If we think of the function of passing a ball, we want to design a robot that will pass a basketball. Some analogies you can make to passing a basketball are perhaps material handling in the player. You're moving things from one place to another, and conveyors are something you might think about. Launching or throwing something, well, rockets are a way of launching things. Also, you can send things by not using physical objects like EM waves, radio communications, or waves in the ocean. Maybe you can get something from that analogy. Or the simple idea of UPS or FedEx delivering things, driving around. Now they're looking at drones. So these are all things you might be able to apply to passing the ball. Okay, so moving on. How might we? How might we is our next preparation technique. After you've got a good feel for the problem and you've thought about possible analogies, you now want to scope the problem down to something manageable for ideation. So, for example, how might we's are a way that we create that scope. It's a very simple question. And so here are a few examples of that. You can say you're dealing with a problem that you recognize burning gasoline pollutes the atmosphere. You could address this problem in various ways, and you don't want to go into your ideation session with the big problem. You want to focus it. And you can then change that throughout the ideation session. So one how might we might be, how might we capture gasoline pollutants? So go ahead and make them, but then grab them before they get out into the atmosphere. How might we store and use energy for transportation? So this redirects it. Let's not burn gasoline. Let's do something else. How might we eliminate the pollutants from gasoline? So still burn it, but not get the outcomes. So these are some examples of how might we questions. Let's move on to stoking. Stoking is about getting yourself into the right frame of mind to do ideation. We, particularly engineers, we have a tendency of approaching problems from a very structured process. And that's a good thing. There's lots of analytical problems that would take a lot longer if we didn't have a structured approach. However, that structured approach, that rigorous analytical way of approaching a problem gets in the way of ideation. If you're thinking that way, you're not going to come up with great new solutions. You're just going to be looking at a logical process. And ideas don't come from logical processes. So stoking is what we refer to as the method that you use to get out of that. are many ways to stoke. I like stoking that involves some form of physical activity. For instance, for me, just going for a run gets me out of a mental rut. So that itself forms a stoke for me. There are some other things people use: brain teasers, quick design and build challenges, doing something that involves being physical and mental at the same time. Whatever you do, please make sure this is a fun activity, because we want ideation to be fun. You'll get better ideas if you're having fun. So if you start out with the stoking as a fun activity, it gets you into that mode as well. I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples here. We're not going to spend much time on these, but for example, here's a brain teaser that you might use as a team to try to do some stoking to get you thinking of ideas, because that's what brain teasers are, finding solutions to problems. But they are so low stakes that you don't feel the pressure of solving the problem. It's more like a fun activity. Build activities, making paper airplanes is a great one. It doesn't require a whole lot of materials. Try to make it even more interesting. Like, you have to do a paper airplane design you've never seen before. Or maybe you can do the build only using one hand or something like that. My favorite physical mental stoke activity is when you can get together with people. So if we're still in a pandemic, then you're not going to do this sort of thing. But throwing a ball, and when you catch the ball, you have to add a word to a story, and you let this story kind of grow organically. And it's usually a lot of fun. Some individual stoking activities might be just fill a paper with some squiggles, random squiggles, and then turn them into birds, or whatever you want to. Turn them into something else. And this is engaging a part of your brain that maybe you don't use very often, thinking creatively about how to turn one thing into another. That's going to get you in the right frame of mind. Stoke activities, any sort of physical activity could be a stoke activity. Dancing is a common one. Dance as if no one can see you. Make sure you don't hit anything if you do that. This can be a great way for you to get yourself in the right frame of mind. Okay, so let's start talking about the techniques themselves. The 4 common ones that I'm going to walk through here are brainstorming, brain writing or brain sketching, variants of the same thing, brain dumping, and brain walking. So brainstorming, before we even go into that, let me talk about why we're doing this. Why not just come up with ideas? Well, number one, if you've got ideas, write them down. You know, you don't have to, the idea is good regardless of where it comes from, right? The problem is, if we have no technique, most of us can only come up with a few ideas. And that means we're probably leaving some really great ones out, unstated. So here's a study that I ran about 8 or 10 years ago in my philosophy of design class, where I gave the students, first day of class, instructions to try to come up with an improved bicycle transmission. So it was a relatively broad problem statement, but it was using the basic idea. It's a bicycle, we want to have better power transmission in it. And then I sent them off for 20 minutes to try to come up with ideas related to that. One group I gave, well, 2 groups I gave no technique to. I just said, go do it. 2 groups, I told them about the scamper technique, which is a fairly complicated technique. It usually requires some training and practice to do well. We're actually not talking about that today because of that. Then brainstorming and the basic instructions that I'll talk through in a couple of minutes. And then brainstorming with some tools so that everyone was able to record their ideas rather than one person doing it. And then finally, brain writing. And I was astonished at these results. So it was averaged across teams. The no technique had very few ideas. That did not surprise me. I've certainly heard of this a lot. Scamper and brainstorming were similar. Scamper theoretically could do better, but there was no real training for it. Brainstorming did not do as well as I had expected. It was only double, no technique at all. But as soon as I gave the same instructions but gave teams Post-it notes and said, so the only additional instruction was everybody take several Post-it notes and write your own ideas down. That doubled the amount of ideas we got out just by not having one individual as the screen for writing ideas down. And then finally, the brain writing one, that was amazing to me. I had never done it before this class, and that was not quite double, but what, like 80% more than even the brainstorming with Post-its. And so we'll talk about those. So this kind of data is why we try to use these ideation tools. They really do help get ideas. But now you might say, well, who cares? Most of those ideas are probably terrible ideas. Why do we want more? Well, it's probably reasonable to assume that the best ideas are going to come out randomly in time. You might get a few, you might have a couple of really good ideas early on because you've been pondering this for a while and they've been rattling around. But as you continue to generate ideas, there's no reason why any particularly good ideas will come up at any other point in time. So let's assume that of all the ideas you're going to come up with, maybe only 5% of them are good. That's a reasonable number, right? We probably can do that. So that means that if you generate 10 ideas, you might not have any good ones, right? But if you generate 100, you ought to get maybe around 5 good. If you can get 500 ideas, now we're getting some reasonable number of good ideas. So the goal here is to get a lot of ideas in ideation, and that then when we move to idea evaluation, we can get better ideas out of it. And that's the whole purpose of this. So back to brainstorming. You've all heard about brainstorming. You've all done brainstorming. I suspect a lot of you have probably been doing it improperly because there are not many people that I know who actually teach the rules of brainstorming because we think, oh, it's ideation, it's creative, so there aren't any rules. Well, that's crap. Right? There are rules. There are ways to do things well, and there are ways to do things not well. Now, there are also bad ways to apply rules and good ways to apply them. So with these brainstorming rules, the last thing you want to do is yell at someone in a meeting and say, you're breaking the rule, because that will totally crush the good feeling, the interaction, what STOKE did for you to get to make this a good event. But you do want to gently remind people if you find that you're straying as a group, or even remind yourself if you're doing an individual brainstorming that you're starting to evaluate things. Or whatever. So the 4 main rules are: defer judgment. Don't evaluate the ideas. You can do it later. That's why it's a deferment. You're not saying that we can't evaluate ideas. We're just not doing it right at this moment. Secondly, focus on quantity. The instant you say, I want lots of good ideas, you are evaluating every idea, right? So no evaluation, it's purely number. So I usually say, if we're going into an ideation session, we're going to want a minimum of 100 ideas before we walk out, or a minimum of 200. Literally hundreds of ideas you want out of these sessions, because you can do it. It's easy to do if you get in the mindset. Third one, build on the ideas you hear. So you need to pay attention to the other ideas coming out in the session, and then immediately think, what can I do with that? Where could I take that? What else could that idea become? And then lastly, crazier ideas are better. Try to be wacky and wild with this. Number one, it's fun to do, and it generates more ideas, because you're thinking of crazy ones, you're specifically not evaluating. So that's our goal here. So those are the 4 ideas, our 4 rules. Defer judgment, focus on many ideas, give yourself a numerical target, build on the ideas you hear, and focus on getting crazy ideas. Okay, this should be fun, remember. So how do you avoid judging ideas? Think when someone says something, you want to mentally at least respond, and maybe verbally, yes, and. Because yes, you're affirming that they've given you an idea. Not whether it's good or bad, just that it's an idea. And the and is, what can I do with that idea? So that's the build piece. Avoid yes, but at all costs. And avoid any of these other expressions. Even things nonverbal, making a sigh or rolling your eyes, those can be terrible in an ideation session with other people. If they think that you're evaluating them based on the quality of their ideas, they're only going to say ideas that they think are good, which means they're cutting out, well, based on my earlier numbers, 95% of the ideas they might say. And one of those bad ideas that they had could be the one that triggered the really awesome idea in a teammate. So avoid anything that hints at judging. Don't even say, hey, that's a great idea, because that is a form of judgment. Just say, thanks, or yes, that's an idea. Okay, it's a little odd. You got to figure out the terminology there. Anyway, how do you set up? So one thing I recommend is have a facilitator, someone who's focused on those rules, and have it be someone who can gently nudge people to follow them. You don't want a strict rule follower to be your facilitator, because that's not going to work well either. Make sure everyone can record their own ideas. As I saw in that 234 study, that was really helpful. Make sure the ideas, when they're generated, are visible to everyone. So everyone writes with large print on a whiteboard, or everybody has a post-it note pack, or if you're online, use Google Jamboard or even Google Docs where you can type in the ideas, but everyone sees everyone's ideas. That's really important. And then keep it short. That's the last thing to think about. Plan out for like a 20 to 30-minute session. It will start to get feeling long. If you're doing this well, it's somewhat tiring. It's fun, but it's tiring. And as we'll hear later, one of the techniques is to actually take breaks in between. One of the techniques to avoid getting stuck. Okay, let's talk about brain writing and brain sketching. So this is like brainstorming, but we're doing it on paper and we're doing it sequentially. So that's the interesting thing. You're going to work silently to write down ideas on a piece of paper or in a Google Jamboard page, but nobody's looking at your ideas while you're putting them down. So nobody can dominate the conversation. Nobody can critique your ideas. So it sort of avoids that risk that you have when you're doing things in a group. So here's the process. Whether you're using a page or a Jamboard sheet or whatever, start just listing out your own ideas. Use words, use sketches if you can. After 3 to 5 minutes, so keep that relatively short, hand your page to someone else. So if it's online, just you switch which page you're looking at. And then you're going to get a new page. You read through the ideas or skim over the sketches or whatever, and then take 3 to 5 minutes to record any new ideas you come up with. Don't repeat the ideas you already wrote down. That's not the point of this, right? We want new ideas, not just repeating old ideas. And then you keep going until the initial page you started with comes back to you. So again, a shared Google Doc or Jamboard with multiple pages works just fine for this online. This is pretty cool because it totally eliminates that someone dominating or the risk of evaluation. Okay, what about brain dump? So brain dump I like to do right at the beginning of a brainstorming session. And it's just the opportunity for everyone to dump everything that's already on their mind. Because you've probably been thinking of ideas for your problem already. So get them written down. That's great. And just a couple of hints here. These are actually relevant to all of the ideation techniques. Your environment matters. So when you're going to do brain dumping or brainstorming, get comfortable. Put some inspirational things around you so you can glance at them and get ideas from them. And then remind yourself about the how might we questions and just start writing down and do it for a limited time. 5 to 10 minutes is usually perfectly fine for a brain dump. And so that's kind of like the beginning of a brain writing session as well. And they are very similar. Let's talk about that last one, brain walking. Brain walking is kind of a fun one. This one is active. The other ones are kind of standing or sitting and writing, but brain walking is about seeing things and moving around to generate ideas. If you can, act out the design challenge. Pretend, if you can get into the space where the user is experiencing their design challenge, that's even better. You can see all the things that they're interacting with. Walk through the motions and write down any ideas you have as you're going through them. Picture yourself in that situation and visualize how you're going to get out of it. And that visualization then is your ideation. Look at the different things around you. Move into other rooms. Just get that activity. I like to call this change your scenery and change your ideas. So brain walking is kind of a thing that I like to do after an initial brainstorming session. And it's sort of a getting yourself unstuck. There are lots of reasons why this can be successful. I suggest just giving it a try and see what happens. It is something you can do individually or with a group, but it works equally well either way, and bring back the ideas to the group afterwards if you do it individually. Okay, so what happens when you're trying out a brainstorming session and let's say you're 15 minutes in and there are no more ideas coming? Well, number one, I say throw another how might we at it. I didn't even list that as one of these get unstucks, but that's absolutely something you can do. Change the problem scope a little bit by proposing another how might we. But here are a couple of other things you can do as well. I love this one, worst possible idea. We often feel pressure to get good ideas. And the whole point of brainstorming is to not evaluate, but we're not great at that, right? Evaluation is what we do. So give yourself some freedom. Instead of trying to get good ideas, deliberately try to find bad ones. And you might discover, usually we do as a team, that those bad ones actually aren't as bad as we thought. Sometimes they're really good. They're just unusual. And so we call them bad. Other times they are not great ideas on their own, but they trigger something for someone else, and we can continue on into a regular brainstorming session. So a quick example of that. Let's look at this robot basketball player again. Worst possible idea, suppose that you got to make it from an old suit of armor, or you can only use sound sensors, no vision sensors, or the legs have to be pogo sticks. You know, those are not great ideas, but maybe we can do something with that. You know, maybe non-vision sensors triggers us to think about other types of tactile sensors. Who knows? What's the worst idea you can think of for a robot basketball player? All right, let's talk about incubation. Have you ever had that feeling you walk out of an exam or out of a little bit of a tense situation, and then suddenly you think what you should have written down or what you should have said to someone? Incubation is the theory that describes that. Your conscious mind focuses on something but can't necessarily get to the solution. When you allow your subconscious to take over, you often get inspirational results from that. So giving yourself a break in between your ideation can be a great thing to do. Imposing constraints is another way. I mentioned giving yourself a new how might we. Impose constraints and challenge assumptions are both variants of that, redefining the problem to make it, to give yourself a different scope that maybe will trigger new ideas. Impose constraints is about artificially adding to your problem statement, because sometimes the problem statement is too open-ended and we get stymied by that breadth of opportunity. So narrow your focus into an area. An artificial crate, it's counterintuitive, but artificially constraining the design space can often give you more ideas. They tend to be in that space, but you can just do this multiple times. You know, trigger your laser around in different directions and see what you get. So a quick example, deciding a ladder that won't fall down, let's say. That's a fairly big challenge, not that big, but let's suppose that we limit it to be only made from parts from a washing machine, or wash dishes. How can you do it without using water? These are problems that you could solve. The first one, I'm not sure why you would. The second one is certainly something being done in practice. And you get different ideas when you approach the problem that way. Looking at our robot basketball player, suppose that we decided that the robot couldn't make physical contact with the ball. What kind of ideas do you get out of that? What if we couldn't use batteries to power them? Or what if the robot was smaller than the ball was? What if we could only have spinning wheels as part of the moving mechanism? Anything can work as an imposition of constraints, and it can be very impressive what you can get out of it. Challenge assumptions. Let's talk about that real quick. So when you go into solving a problem, you have hopefully tried to drop false assumptions. But sometimes even the real assumptions, you need to get rid of temporarily. So some things that maybe you thought were necessary are actually over-constraining the problem for you. Dropping even a real one might introduce some new ideas. So ask yourself, what am I assuming about this design problem? And actually write down what you're assuming, and then deliberately violate those assumptions one by one and see what ideas you get. It can be pretty cool. So as an example, we might be assuming that our robot basketball player looks in some sense like a basketball player. Probably doesn't have to, right? We can get rid of that. We might be assuming that arms and hands must be some part of this. Probably not really true. We might be assuming that it must be electrically powered. Maybe there's another way to do this. So when you identify an assumption you have, you then deliberately try to violate that assumption with new ideas. And some of those ideas might be awesome, but at a minimum, whatever ideas you come up with will likely trigger additional ideas. And that's the whole point of brainstorming. Okay, so some other techniques. I just want to point out that each of these is just a tool, right? There are literally hundreds of ideation methods out there. These are some of the most common. They tend to work pretty well. We want you to be familiar with many different tools so that you can try different ones in different applications. There is no right rule about which one works, but I want to remind you that whatever you try, please remember those 4 basic ideation brainstorming rules: deferring judgment while you're ideating, focusing on quantity, building on the ideas, and encouraging the wacky or crazy ideas. Those are the key things that will help you be more creative. Okay, so try them out. Use the ones that work on a given problem. You know, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's about getting these tools in your toolbox. I hope that you find these helpful as you move into your design challenges.